The key point was that 15, 20 years ago, before budget support had started, the Tanzanian government was scarcely able to finance the salaries of its civil servants and to finance, the electricity and the water that went through government buildings. It's now in a position to have a very substantial development program of its own, which is decided by its own parliament, audited by its own Auditor General, and discussed in the public domain. That's partly because domestic revenue has improved enormously, but it's also because budget support now goes through the budget. As Mr. Lim said, the only modality that fully complies with the government's own Public Finance Management Act. But what that means is that rather than having a great multitude of projects with little information, a lot of contradictions, a lot of transaction costs, 40% of aid goes through the government budget, it's discussed in Parliament, it's audited, and we know the results from that process. Unfortunately, we still don't know the results of very many of the projects and common basket funds that still exist. Having said that, I also take Bwana Limu's point that perhaps we don't say enough about the results of the budget and the results of budget support. And in that sense, I'm very proud to be able to share with you the results of our evaluation, because I think it's a very positive story for the most part, and it's a story that suggests that the decisions taken initially some 15 years ago, but reconfirmed over the years, have generally been a good idea. Not in every respect, and for how long it will continue to be useful to provide budget support to Tanzania is another question, because obviously there is a process of evolution, and the government hopes to be able to graduate away from aid within our own lifetimes. So it's not going to carry on forever. Nevertheless, there's much to be learned and a significant positive story. The other point I'd like to make before starting is that although I'm here making the presentation on behalf of everybody, this has been very much a team event. My colleague Tim Rufer is here. He's one of about 15 members of the evaluation team. We worked very closely with the government team, with Mr. Magonya, the Commissioner for External Resources, and his team, and with the European Union and the development partners. So this is very much a team approach, and I present it in that spirit as a collaborative exercise from which we can all learn. It's just to remind ourselves of what the objective of the evaluation was. And it's laid down in quite an explicit way, which I think makes it a lot easier to understand how budget support works. So in the first instance, budget support is a flow of funds, if you like, which provides means, resources, to the government of Tanzania to achieve the objectives of the government's own strategy, its own development plan. It also tries, through policy dialogue, through technical assistance, to help improve the design and implementation of the government's own strategies. So there's a process of interaction which should have a positive effect on the quality of policy and the quality of its implementation. And the end result is to get some final outcomes and impacts on the growth and poverty reduction process. And we broke our presentation down between these three areas. If I could start with the first, obviously if we don't achieve this part of getting the resources over to the government of Tanzania, we don't achieve anything. So this is actually rather important. The first point to make is that, just moving on, is that budget support in Tanzania has been extremely important. It's one of only 4 countries, together with Mozambique, Burkina Faso, and I think Rwanda, where budget support has represented more than 10% of public spending for a period of over 5 years. So over the period that we looked at, which was, if you like, the second stage of budget support from 2006 onwards, it represented some $16 per head of the population, slightly, close to $700 million per year. And if you can just see, I'm not sure if this is in your way, maybe we just move it slightly. If you can see these numbers here at the bottom, as a percentage of total expenditure, it's been above 10 for most of the period, coming down in the most recent years, predominantly because domestic revenue has increased. If you look at the actual numbers, the total value of budget support is not dramatically less than it used to be. This middle year is a bit of an outlier because as a response to the financial crisis, there was a big increase in the amount of budget support disbursements. So just to move to the next slide, what we can see here, the bars represent the amount of budget support and the line represents its proportion of official development assistance. And as you can see, although it has fluctuated, it's been between 30 and 40% for most of the period since 2002. And a very substantial proportion of public spending, as we saw just now. The other key thing about budget support as a funding mechanism is that it should be predictable. If you're providing more than 10% of public spending, it's rather important that the Treasury should know when those resources are arriving, and it should have a degree of confidence that they will arrive so that government commitments can be met. So what we've done here is to compare the relative predictability of budget support in comparison with common basket funds, which is the dotted blue line, and projects, which is the purple line. So what we've looked at is the amount that was dispersed at the end of the year in comparison with what was predicted to be dispersed in the budget itself. So the red line represents budget support, and as we can see, the disbursements have usually been over 100% of what was predicted. Whereas for projects, they've been somewhere less than 60% in recent years, but even in early periods, much less, and much more volatile. So budget support on an annual basis is significantly more predictable, or has been in Tanzania, than common basket funding or projects. Moving to the next slide, the other aspect of predictability which is important given some of the difficulties of raising Treasury funding, not only the United States, but Tanzania also has problems covering its debt finance. And in the event that budget support does not arrive, then the government would have to issue Treasury bills to cover the same commitments. And in order to avoid that, it's important that predictability within years should also be good. So what we show here is the disbursements by quarter in comparison with the prediction. So that there's a Treasury plan made at the outset of the year based on the commitments of budget support, and we've compared the actual disbursements with the original Treasury plan. So if everything was perfect, our blue line would be right on top of the little black line. So in other words, there would be no difference between the projections and the actual disbursements. What we see here is that there has been a movement. Initially, it was fairly close to the line. There were some big changes, but this was very largely due to the additional disbursements that were made in 2010 in a response to the financial crisis. What we can see in more recent years is that the predictability is again coming close to what it should be. So it's not perfect, but not bad. By comparison with projects and common basket funds, it's not even possible to generate this graph because they don't even try to predict what the disbursements will be by quarter. Substantial amounts of funding, approximately equivalent to 12-13% of public spending, somewhere around 35% of total aid, delivered in a predictable manner. What's it been spent on? This is obviously a big question, and it's quite a difficult question to answer because we could also ask, how is Mr. Limo's tax money being spent in Tanzania? And the question is in fact the same. In principle, we could say that Mr. Limo is spending a little bit of his money on debt servicing, a little bit on education, a little bit on the President's office, a little bit on defense. And we could say the same thing about budget support, but it doesn't really reflect the way in which budget support is used. If the government of Tanzania had no budget support, it would still have to meet its commitments for debt servicing, it would still have to meet its commitments for salaries, and it would still try as hard as possible to meet all of the recurrent commitments for the running of government operations. So what we've done here in this graph is to stack spending according to the degree of discretionality. So this blue bit here is interest payments. We then have salary payments here. This green bit represents goods, services and transfers financed through the recurrent budget. The blue bit represents development financing, domestically financed, and the salmon-coloured bit represents externally financed development spending. So in other words, if the government was not receiving project money, logically it would stop financing projects. If it was not receiving budget support, it would only have this amount of money, which is the amount representing domestic revenue. And we would suggest that if the government had not had this proportion, which is the amount corresponding to budget support, then logically the bit that it would not have been able to finance would have been exactly this part. In other words, what has happened as a result of getting these extra resources is that the domestically financed development budget has been able to be substantially greater than it would otherwise have been, and non-salary spending has also been greater. And as I'm sure you all know, non-salary spending in most countries is exactly the spending that makes a difference. It means that teachers have something to teach with, it means that agricultural extension workers have seeds to give out, etc., etc. So developmentally, spending on non-salary recurrent spending, spending on investment are exactly where we would want our money to be going. And this is exactly where we believe the budget support has made it possible for the government of Tanzania to expand its spending. Moving on to the sectors. So far we're ticking quite a few boxes. A reasonable amount of money, predictable resources, going to the economic areas of spending which are likely to get an impact. So the next question is, which sectors has it gone to? And the key thing is that during the period of the budget support evaluation that we've undertaken, there's been a significant rise in public spending overall, and within that, in particular, on the priority sectors. So the priority sectors increased from 8.8% of GDP to 13.9%. And this is in a period where GDP has been growing at 6% in real terms. So in terms of the actual amount of money going in these sectors, the difference is much, much greater. But what we can see then, looking at the period, these are the 6 sectors designated as priority sectors. The big gains have been in education, which has increased from 3.6 to 4.8, and also in roads, which increased from 1% to somewhere close to 4%. We've seen modest increases in agricultural spending and in energy spending. Health has remained fairly stagnant, but there's a reason for this, because simultaneous with the rise of budget support, we've also seen the rise of the Global Fund and of other health funds which have been provided essentially off budget. So total health spending in this period has not declined, it's just that a higher proportion of it has been financed through external financing, which is off budget. The water sector does show a small decline, and I'm not quite sure why this is. I suspect that this is partly because water sector funding is financed through local governments. So there's been a little bit of a shift in spending. Nevertheless, the broad picture, good morning, the broad picture is a positive one. Significant increases in the priority sectors, which are exactly the sectors where the budget support partners wanted resources to go to. Continuing with this idea of trying to understand the impact of budget support, again, we don't think it's useful to say that budget support is like tax revenues. Budget support is the marginal bit of government spending. If the government was not receiving budget support, it would still have to spend its own money. So the marginal bit of spending allows change in the marginal areas. So if education has expanded fast in this period, as it has, and if road spending has expanded fast, as it has, then it's very likely that this would not have been possible in the absence of budget support. And these graphs show that. So what we've done here, this bit here corresponds to the amount of domestic revenue that would have gone to this sector if the amount of domestic revenue it was getting was the same as it was in the period before budget support. Okay? So we're assuming that the sector share didn't change, and we allocated the domestic revenue between the sectors. So that's how much education would have got, that's how much roads would have got, this is how much health would have got. Okay? The green bit here corresponds to projects and common basket funds. And the sort of purpley bit corresponds to sector budget support. So in the education sector, if they had had their own money, the domestic revenue, plus the project that we know that they got, plus the sector budget support, that is how much they would have spent. In reality, this is how much they ended up spending. So we assume that that is the contribution of general budget support to the education sector, a very significant proportion of the total spend. Now, of course, you might challenge these assumptions. We're never absolutely certain what would have happened if there hadn't been budget support. But this seems a reasonable way of looking at it. And similarly, you can see that the contribution to the road sector has been dramatic. On the other hand, as I was explaining earlier, because the health sector has been receiving fairly large amounts of common basket funds and projects, the actual amount of domestic revenue has fallen. So actually, if the same amount of domestic revenue that they were getting prior to budget support had continued to be provided to health, health spending would be higher than it is now. But what the government has done, logically, is to say, well, we're receiving large amounts of money from the Global Fund, we don't believe health needs that much money, so we're actually going to reprioritize. So we're seeing here a shift in priorities towards education, towards roads, given the very high spending from other sources in the health sector. Let's just summarize where we are then. In terms of the means to contribute to the implementation of government policy. Budget support allowed public spending to be 13% higher than it would otherwise have been, and most of that is likely to have gone to development spending and to non-salary recurrent spending. It has been significantly more predictable than other modalities. It could be better on an annual level, but significantly more predictable than other modalities. And this has allowed expansion of social sector staffing, non-salary spending, development spending, and that spending has accrued predominantly to the 6 priority sectors, and in particular to education and roads. So, moving on from that, we've essentially, through this modality, achieved the main initial objectives of budget support. I'm going to come back to issue number 2, about how far budget support has helped to improve policies. So let me jump to issue number 3, which is about what has been the impact of all of this spending on outcomes and on growth and poverty reduction. So I mentioned roads as one area where we've seen a big increase in spending. What you can see here, unfortunately the data is not good enough to take us back a little bit further, because I think it would be a more dramatic picture. But it's nevertheless a pretty good one in itself. This shows the total length of the national road network, combining paved and unpaved roads and looking at regional and trunk roads as well. And it tells us the condition of that road network. So we can see that the road network increased from about 25,000 kilometers to somewhere close to 30,000. That's from 2008, which is a pretty short period for that level of expansion. And that despite that significant expansion, the proportion of roads which are in good or fair condition has actually increased. So we've expanded the network by somewhere like 18% in a period of 4 years, and we've kept the quality of those roads significant. A pretty good result, I think. I'm going to talk in a moment about growth and the relationship of growth to roads. We did actually try to do a little bit of econometrics on this. We didn't quite have enough data. But I think we all know that transportation, communications is essential for growth, and there's enough anecdotal evidence to suggest that this improvement in the road network was important in the maintenance of the growth performance of Tanzania. But let's look at education. This was the other big area of spending, the biggest expansion area. And we had a situation where enrollment was already pretty close to universal primary enrollment at the beginning of the period. And it's actually fluctuated. But nevertheless, we can see that the net enrollment rate remained fairly close to 100% in terms of primary spending. The big change was in secondary spending. And we had an increase in the transition rate from primary to secondary of more than 100%. In other words, the transition rate doubled, more than doubled, from 20% in 2006 to slightly over 50% in 2012. And simultaneously, the gross enrollment rate for secondary rose from 9.4 to somewhere under 40%. So we're looking at a tremendous increase in the numbers of children able to have access to secondary schooling. One of the big problems in Tanzania traditionally has been the rather limited numbers of people going to secondary schooling and going on to tertiary education, which has been a significant brake on the overall development of the country. So we've seen in this period a big change in exactly this factor, and this has been made possible because of the increased spending. The number of university students also rose very dramatically. So whilst spending on university education was increasing, we were still able to expand secondary schooling very dramatically and to continue to get increases in the primary level. So the whole education cycle has improved, and this has been made possible through the funding. Gender parity remains an issue at university level and at secondary level, but it's getting better, and at primary level it's already been achieved. So we have the same number, in fact slightly more girls than boys going to school just because of the demographic structure. But gender parity has been achieved at primary, and we're approaching it at secondary, still some way away at university level. Okay, so that's the big picture, and our sense as an evaluation team is that in and of itself those results already justify having invested resources in budget support. That's not to say there's not problems, and that's not to say that further things couldn't be improved. There remain a number of challenges in the education sector. Quality remains an issue. At one level, it's not entirely surprising when you get such a very large increase in numbers of pupils coming through the system. And we also need to understand that many of the pupils now going to secondary school come from households where their parents would not even have primary schooling. And as I think we know from education all around the world, the level of education of the parents is a main determinant of the performance of children. So this reduction in quality is to a degree understandable, but it's obviously worrying for the Tanzanian government and for those supporting it. We've seen that secondary pass rates remain very low, and in particular for community schools, which are the newest schools. So in 2011, we had roughly 10% of pupils passing the certificate of secondary education. So after 4 years of schooling, when they do the equivalent of what we would call in England GCE O levels, roughly 10% are passing. Could be better, obviously, but the key point is that even though it's only 10% passing, the numbers of people passing is greater than it was in the past. So the level of expansion of the system has meant that the numbers coming out of secondary school with passes are still higher than they were. Obviously, the system would be a good deal more efficient if we could get that pass rate up, and it remains an issue. Teacher retention in rural areas, again, is a major issue. So these are concerns which remain on the table, and which we hope can be resolved. Nevertheless, just moving on to the next. At the primary level, the key driver of performance, less so at secondary level, but at primary level, the key driver is the pupil-teacher ratio. If you can get pupil-teacher ratios closer to 40:1, you get better pass rates, better learning. That's very clear from all of the econometric work we did in Tanzania, and which has been done in other countries as well. And fortunately, what we can see is that pupil-teacher ratios are improving both on the average and perhaps more importantly in terms of the standard deviation. One of the big problems in countries like Tanzania is that you could very easily get a maximum pupil-teacher ratio much higher than the minimum. And we can see here that they're all coming together. So in 2008, within the lowest decile, in other words, the schools that had the lowest numbers of pupil per teacher, the average was 33.8. It has fallen slightly to 30, but we've seen a much bigger fall in the highest decile. So those schools in the remote rural areas which used to have 80:1 pupil-teacher ratios are now getting somewhere close to 60:1. Still not good, but a whole lot better than it was. The mean has fallen, the median has improved, the standard deviation is the big change. And that's a positive thing. And part of the reason for this is that increasingly there's been more of a decentralization of the management of education policy. So our evaluation team were able to visit a number of districts, and we found, for example, in Mkinga district in the Tanga region, secondary school science teachers, instead of being assigned to one school, were being given a sort of, what's the phrase, perambulatory role. So they would teach science in one school on Monday, a different school on Tuesday, a different school on Wednesday, and in that way the coverage of science teaching in the secondary schools was significantly improved. In Morogoro urban district, which has a different sort of problem, Morogoro is certainly in this decile, but outside of Morogoro urban district is Morogoro rural district, which oddly enough used to be within this decile. Well, what they've done there is to provide loans for teachers to live in the urban areas with their spouses, but buy motorcycles or mopeds or bicycles to travel to the rural areas. So the pupil-teacher district in Morogoro rural district has fallen very significantly because of this initiative at the local level. So in short, we're seeing positive things happening, and we're seeing an attention to precisely the problems which need to be resolved. So that's really talking at the output level, that's talking about education, talking in particular about the impact of roads. On the growth question, over the last decade, Tanzania has averaged some 7% per annum real growth in its GDP, which means that it's effectively surpassed most of its neighbors. So this red line here is Kenya, the blue line is Tanzania, and that means that GDP in constant terms, Tanzania is now higher than Kenya, but also quite significantly greater and much faster growth than most of the other neighboring countries as well. So a very good growth performance. On the next slide, we look at how far that's been converted into poverty reduction. The figure we use, and it's not a very good figure, is the poverty headcount figure. In other words, simply counting the number of people above and below the poverty line. I say it's not a good figure because we could very easily have a situation in which you have a large number of people just below the poverty line. Because of growth, they all jump above the poverty line, and that gives the impression of a very good improvement in growth. If the situation is different, and at the very beginning you have a lot of people well below the poverty line, after 7 years they may still be below the poverty line. So this is not the best analysis that we can provide, and there is ongoing work which the Statistics Office is doing in Tanzania, supported by the World Bank, to understand exactly what's happening to poverty dynamics. But the basic picture is that there's been a very modest decline in the numbers of people in poverty during the evaluation period. It should be said that in the previous period, up to 2001, we got a much faster decline, from something like 54% in the late 90s to 35% in 2001. So what has happened is we've seen a fast decline in the 90s and a rather steady, modest decline in the more recent period. So still some concerns, but not a bad picture either. On the issue of non-income poverty, the performance has been quite considerably better, with big improvements in the Human Development Index, and quite important improvements in education and ownership of assets, which are captured in the Household Budget Survey. And the issue here is that the poverty statistics which we looked at before, the income statistics, are based on consumption. And if households do not have to pay for education or health, that does not form part of their consumption basket. So we've seen that non-income poverty has improved, but it's not really reflected in the improvements in income poverty. Okay, so we have this diagram. When we first did it, we were a little bit tentative. We thought some people might say we were being too simplistic. But fortunately, our colleagues in Tanzania and our development partners generally like this as being quite a good way of reflecting what has happened. So let me just explain this to you. The idea is that we have here the main inputs into the budget support process. So funds, use of government systems, policy dialogue, and technical assistance. We show the relationship between those inputs and what we call induced outputs, which are really changes in government processes. And then on the far side, we see the relationship between those changes in the government processes and final impacts. The big black lines show significant areas of causality, the dotted lines, more limited causality, the absent lines, no causality. Now, a couple of gaps here which are worth pointing out. In his presentation, Mr. Lima made a big point, and it's an important point, about the contribution of budget support to increased use of government systems. What we found in this period is that although the use of government systems didn't really decline, we did not see any further improvement. So within the evaluation period, there was no additional improvement in the use of government systems, which is why we put no lines between here and other issues. In the earlier phase of budget support, this would have been a much more important factor. Similarly, we found that there was very limited use of technical assistance linked to the other aspects of budget support. So again, no lines from here to there. I've already spoken to you about the way in which funds have been used and the way in which funds were used to promote development spending and to promote spending in the priority sectors. So we see that as having been a significant contribution to economic growth, not so much to the reduction in income poverty, as I pointed out, hence the dotted line, but it has helped a significant reduction in non-income poverty. Okay? So those are the big lines of causality that we see in the Tanzanian period. Dialogue has had modest impacts on a range of areas, but not dramatic. Okay? And that's something which I'd like to turn to now. Because this is in some ways the missing picture of what we would like to achieve or what we would like to have achieved in Tanzania. And what we have said is that we're in a context of a relatively poor country with governance challenges, with human resource challenges, with many policy challenges. The problem Tanzania has of taking children into secondary school whose parents have never been to school at all is not a problem that we've had in Europe, for at least 60 years. In some countries more. But it's a difficult problem. And how does one solve that? And how does budget support help? Well, ideally, budget support should help by providing a framework for setting targets. I mean, one of the issues about moving forward and getting results on a development strategy is to define targets clearly, measure progress towards them, and make sure you discuss why you're progressing and why you're not. Before budget support, there was not a very good system for doing this in Tanzania. And one of the significant contributions of budget support has been to establish that framework. And through the process of dialogue between external partners and the national government, budget support should help to keep attention on core policy issues, on public finance management, on good macroeconomic management. It should ideally help to provide advice on the areas of policy where progress isn't as good as it might be, on issues like quality in education, on issues like improving the coverage of electricity. And it should also provide some incentives to faster implementation of given policies. So this is really the theory. Let's look at what happened, turning to the next slide, on this process. As I've said earlier, the structures for policy dialogue have been established. So what's called the Partnership Framework Memorandum brings together 14 development partners around a set of common targets and around an annual process of monitoring of those targets, which is well harmonized. So we have a standardized annual calendar, a common performance assessment framework, and a relatively good system of harmonization and alignment. So the system is there and it scores relatively well on harmonization and alignment. There's also been some areas, some specific areas, where we found evidence of real influence. When I say we found evidence, this is because we saw change and we found that both on the government side and on the part of the development partners, both agreed that this change would not have happened in the absence of the budget support dialogue. So some areas which have been important, So the consistent attention to the public finance management reform program, which Mr. Lima also mentioned in his presentation, the consistent support for the road fund, which is the mechanism through which roads are maintained in Tanzania, the introduction of capitation grants for secondary schools as a way of financing non-salary spending, the introduction of budget transparency targets for the publication of budget documents and audit reports and things like that, and the establishment of high-level dialogue on corruption. Each of these have been important. Nevertheless, moving to the next slide, taking the process of policy dialogue as a whole, these improvements are not what one would have expected within a second-generation budget support arrangement which had already been running for some 5 or 6 years before the beginning of our evaluation period. And what we actually found was that there was actually a declining level of ownership, a declining commitment to the process from the government side and from some of the development partners. Big increases in transaction costs. So the whole process of setting targets, monitoring them, discussing them, became much more complicated, much more burdensome than it had been. The indicators through which progress were measured started to decline in quality. There were much more changes year to year and some very poor indicators. And overall, we did not see the sort of strategic problem-solving orientation. So I've laid out for you this morning a big problem in education. Do we see evidence of clever ideas about how to improve pass rates in secondary education? No, we don't. This doesn't seem to be on the table. Do we see evidence of how to improve the cost of energy provision in urban areas, which is a big problem for Tanzania, and a big brake on industrial growth? No, we don't. So the key strategic areas were not getting attention, and the ones that were getting attention were getting it in a burdensome, difficult way. And we've got a few statistics just to illustrate that. Perhaps if we could jump to the next one. This transaction costs are always difficult to assess, but what we did look at was the number of indicators, the number of meetings, the length of reports, the time it took for reviews between start and finish. And across all of these indicators, the situation worsened. And in particular, the number of indicators in the performance assessment framework, the PAF, grew from somewhere around 55, which was already quite a lot at the beginning of the period, to 89 in 2007-08. It has declined since, because this problem has been noticed, but it was nevertheless not a transaction cost-friendly manner of managing. The other issue, I was pointing out the problems with the quality of indicators. Well, over 12% of the indicators proved unmeasurable. So one sets up a set of indicators, one creates a dialogue which is supposed to be important, and then the indicators themselves can't be measured. One might expect to get something wrong when you define an indicator, but not 1 in 10 indicators basically being unmeasurable. And the other point, which is rather interesting, of those indicators that were defined as being partially addressed, many of them were completely dropped in the next year. So if it had been important in year 1, why then were they dropped in year 2? But 25% were not followed up at all. And out of most of these years, 1/3 of the indicators were changed every single year, which suggested that we weren't focusing on the real strategic issues, because in general, strategic issues don't change very much from one year to another. Obviously, if an indicator is not good, one should change it. But if you're trying to have a set of indicators that represent the areas of strategic attention, one should expect consistency, and we certainly did not get that. So, to conclude, we have, and this is my final slide for those of you who are beginning to get worried, we have a situation where budget support facilitated expanded spending on priority sectors and brought tangible benefits in service delivery, most especially in education, but also to a degree in roads and road maintenance. We've also seen steady progress in public finance management reform, not dramatic, not as good as in the previous period, but steady. Improvements in the transparency of budget documentation, and some strengthening of anti-corruption work. I'll just mention this as an aside, but the anti-corruption legislation was passed in 2007, and the number of cases prosecuted by the Anti-Corruption Bureau doubled over the period involved. Non-income poverty has fallen. And all of these are very important results, which should be announced and should be communicated and should be celebrated. But the policy dialogue has not been working as well as it should. And as a result, some of the key policy problems that are a brake on growth and poverty reduction in Tanzania, problems related to education, to agriculture, to energy, are not being solved. So our essential conclusion is that the modality, let's say, has scored 6.5 out of 10. Whereas with some real attention to the way dialogue could be managed and some real attention to improving policy, we ought to be getting somewhere closer to 8 or 9. So good so far, but could do better. And we'll focus on the recommendations, I think, after lunch. Thank you very much for your attention.